In Portland, Oregon, there is a street that does not exist. Big deal, right? Most of the streets in the world exist outside of one city. But when this one particular street did exist, it was about as minuscule a length as such a thing could be. Running between First and Front Avenues for over a century, at only 200 feet in length, Vine Street was the shortest street in the city's history. For reference, let's take a walk down the route formerly known as Vine. That's it. That was Vine Street. So what's the point? I mean, how could a street so short be of any interest or have any kind of history worth remembering? That's the funny thing about history. There's always something interesting to find. Today, the site formerly known as Vine Street is the southern part of what is known as the Ankeny Arcade, running between the famous Skidmore Fountain and some old cast iron building columns to the north and the city's central fire station to the south. This area is lined with blocks, which is apropos because the original Vine Street that passed through here for much of its history was constructed using blocks. Belgian blocks, to be precise. The site of the Ankeny Arcade, while in a historic district, looks quite different than it did in the city's early years, in particular the 1800s. Despite being the shortest street in town, Vine Street was at the epicenter of the city's one-time flourishing commercial district, when it existed closer to the waterfront. As I've discussed in the past, there is a distinct break in the direction that streets travel in modern-day downtown Portland. This is due to land claims taken out by early Portlanders. The site of present-day Ankeny Street was the divider between Benjamin Stark's land claim to the south and Captain John H. Couch's land claim to the north, and thus Ankeny is where this deviation occurs, at least as far west as modern-day 8th Street, or Avenue. It did stretch one block further to Park, but that block has been closed in recent years. In fact, several of West Side Ankeny has been closed over time. It also bordered Vine Street directly to the north, and, like Vine, no longer exists between First and the Nadeau Parkway, formerly Front Avenue. With Ankeny being the divider between this change in route directions and Vine being the next street to the south, this is the simple explanation for why Vine Street was so short. With all the east-west traveling streets running at an angle into Ankeny and Burnside further west, the closer they were to Ankeny from Front Avenue, the shorter they were, and Vine was the closest. This change in street directions also explains why the block between Vine, Ankeny, First, and Front was shaped like a triangle. Vine Street is so short that in early maps, even with the street name only being 4 letters long, they could barely fit the name onto the street. On some maps, the name Vine can clearly be seen in smaller font compared to other nearby streets, clearly out of necessity. While not a great deal is known about Vine Street's earliest years in the City of Roses, for several decades, a flatiron, or triangular-shaped building known as the Bank of British Columbia building, existed on its north end. Historically, the building is said to have been built in 1867, but I must say, in my research, I found in a March 23, 1874 Oregonian, this brief passage that says, "The Bank of British Columbia has been removed to their new and elegant building, corner of Vine and Front Streets." If accurate, and the building was new, then this building was actually erected in the early 1870s. The Bank of British Columbia did exist in Portland during 1867, but it also was previously at a different location. In this regard, either a couple years before or a couple years after this building was constructed, the Ankeny block was built along the south side of Vine Street, built during the years of 1869 and 1870. It was called the largest brick building in Portland at the time of its completion. To the east, along Front Avenue, beautiful pieces of architecture would appear over the next several years into the 1880s. To the west, across First Avenue, was erected the gorgeous Newmarket Theater building in 1872, bringing an element of entertainment and charm to a mainly commercial area. And the cherry on the sundae, the Skidmore Fountain, dedicated in September 1888. As the years passed and things changed, Vine Street's primary source of remembrance of any kind was through the happenings at Skidmore Fountain. Constructed during 1887 into 1888, the fountain was a memorial of sorts for Stephen Skidmore, one of the city's early successful druggists. He came to Portland in 1850 as a child with his family and went into the druggist business as a young man, opening his own pharmacy in 1867. After struggles with an illness, he passed away in 1883 at the age of 44. Prior to this, he left $5,000 in his will to the city to be used in the construction of a drinking fountain for the people of the city, as well as dogs and horses. The city took this opportunity and ran with it, leading to the creation of the fountain that stands on site to this day, at a cost of $18,000. Several locals, including his former business partner Charles Sitton, former banker, businessman, and mayor Henry Failing, and Charles Erskine Scott Wood, a local author, lawyer, and cultural figure whose list of friends included Mark Twain, Charlie Chaplin, Clarence Darrow, John Steinbeck, and Langston Hughes. He would serve as the connection to Olin Warner, the man who would design the fountain, and he also provided the words inscribed on it, which read, "Good citizens are the riches of a city." A banker named Tyler Woodward provided a considerable amount of money under the caveat that the fountain be placed next to land he owned on First Avenue. That's why the fountain was placed specifically where it's at a time where this was conveniently a flourishing part of the city. Surrounded by beautiful architecture, it, and Vine Street for that matter, became associated with the city's commercial success. Later on, primarily in the early 1940s, there would be a push to move the fountain to another location, as, by that time, the area around the fountain and Vine was hardly what it had once been. We'll be getting back to that time period. In terms of the street itself, historically known as being only a block long, early maps of the city suggest it may have stretched beyond First Avenue, almost reaching 2nd as it merged completely with Ankeny. We see this in maps up into 1871, where this map shows it going just a little past First. And perhaps it did, but the following year would see the completion of the Newmarket Theater, whose north wing filled in this area west of First. So if Vine was once just a little longer than a block, By 1872, that was all over. And had that not happened, well, by the time the Skidmore Fountain was put in place, it was right in line with Vine Street. This gets at the heart of this little thoroughfare from the city's early years of prominence. Its insignificance. I mean, they literally stuck a fountain right in front of it at its intersection with First. Like, they didn't want people to use it in the first place. While this was in the days before the automobile, obviously, once they came into the game, using Vine Street was a risky venture. While numerous reasons were given over the years as to why the fountain should have been relocated, to me the most practical reason was the simple fact that it created a driving hazard on Vine, whether you were coming from Front or First. If you look at this view from one of Minor White's late 30s images of Portland, in particular if one was traveling south on First and looking to turn onto Vine, they had to wrap all the way around the fountain or take a big risk cutting through possible oncoming traffic to make the turn faster. And I don't know if you've seen video of how people drove in those earlier years of the automobile, but they were kind of out of control. While a simple search yielded nothing, I get the feeling there were, at the very least, some near misses at this intersection. You can get another perspective of this in old Sanborn fire maps where the fountain looks so oddly placed, like, was it supposed to be a roundabout and they didn't center it right? It looks odd, in particular to an outsider who's never seen this area before. The earliest newspaper reference I found in relation to Vine Street came from September 3rd, 1859, wherein the resuming of planking work on Vine Street was discussed. In 1868, there was a reference to improvements being done on Vine. There understandably wasn't a lot, with it being a street only a block long, but it still was there for some Portland firsts, such as the city's first streetcar line, established by Ben Holliday in 1872. A horse-drawn car line, this ran down First Avenue, or again, First Street, as it was originally known, and there were references to the tracks being laid down on First in the vicinity of Vine. The city's first telephone exchange was established out of the north wing of the New Market Theater in August 1878, right across from and in line with Vine Street. In terms of those based out of addresses on Vine Street, aside from the Bank of British Columbia, the offices for the planned Lewis and Clark Exposition were based at 203 Vine. When a reunion of the city's pioneers was held in 1907, it was noted the oldest pioneer to attend was an Ella Patterson of Vine Street, whose family originally arrived in the area in 1843. Not much of consequence happened on this street specifically, but it was surrounded by a bustling commercial district alive with industries of all sorts, run by and named after some of the city's most prominent early citizens. Vine Street was small, but mighty in its youth. But by the dawn of the 1900s, much of that flame had burned out. The towering architecture surrounding the street loomed mostly vacant, and commerce had moved to the south and further inland. Things had become quiet around Vine Street. In 1928, the Bank of British Columbia building would be demolished, never to be replaced by another building. This left the space between Vine and Ankeny open and seldom used for much aside from parking for the odd car or two, or a storage place for construction materials. After this block was opened up, it was immediately suggested that the Skidmore Fountain be moved a short distance onto that block. At the time, it was owned by the estate of former Portland Mayor David Thompson, and it was made clear that if this move happened, they would gift the block to the city. and it's not like it was being used for much anyway. And it made sense in terms of getting the fountain out of traffic. But there was always great resistance towards moving this town's treasure, even if it was only like 30 feet. The Bank of British Columbia's demolition would serve as the opening for a period of decades of historic architecture destruction, including Ankeny Block, which was gone by 1935. While many other nearby buildings would also come down over the next several years, the loss of these two transformed this simple little street to one without tenants. With no buildings on either side, Vine Street had no businesses or residents, which sounds even crazier when you include the fact that this was a downtown street. After the great address renumbering that Portland went through in the early 30s, in the new directory released in 1933, it included only one address for Vine Street, that being 64 Southwest Vine. And even in this instance, it's noted that this address was not even replacing a previous one. And with no buildings on either side of Vine at this time, I can only wonder what this 64 address was for. This marked the beginning of what really fascinates me the most about Vine Street, as briefly touched on earlier. Its ultimate insignificance in the light of once being at the epicenter of Portland's great significance. The Skidmore Fountain itself was listed most often at being at First and Vine, which made sense as it was more in line with Vine than Ankeny. However, with this, I found multiple instances of this address being listed as First and Pine. Sure, this could have been a mistake. Pine Street is nearby, they differ by one letter, but I almost wonder how many people over time didn't even know there was a Vine Street in the city. An October 1930 article, a rare written piece specifically focused on just Vine Street, included the following. Vine Street is so small and so insignificant that not one person in 1,000 could tell you its location. Perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but the point was made. Even by 1930, this old stone gem was a forgotten stretch that served little purpose beyond serving as a place for people to park their cars on the shoulder. It was the one street in the city where no one had a reason to stop there, for anything. Perhaps that was one of its most endearing qualities, the calm. That 1930 article ended by stating, "In the early dusk, when the rumble of trucks has ceased and the shadows dim the marks of time, one finds a definite charm in the old section. It is serene and peaceful, the calm of old age living quietly with its memories." It was even insignificant in small ways, such as the fact that all the streets surrounding it went beyond Front Street and down to the river, but not Vine. In this image looking south on Front from the Burnside Bridge, another minor white picture, we can see Little Ankeny Street cutting between two buildings, but beyond there, no Vine Street making its way down by the river. And when Portland annexed the towns of East Portland and Albina in 1891, the city renamed the streets running east and west on the east side of the river to match those on the west side. And from Irving Street all the way down to Madison Street, 22 blocks, every street from the west side is represented on the east side, except for Little Vine Street. On the east side, we go straight from Ankeny to Ash. Of course, these streets were renamed to match as close as possible with those on the west side, and the east included two routes not on the west side in Belmont Street and Hawthorne Boulevard, so something had to be sacrificed. It was also during this time of numerous street changes in 1891 that the suggestion was made to change the name of Vine to Skidmore Street, which did make sense at the time. However, this never happened, and that's fine because there is a Skidmore Street nowadays just on the northeast side of Portland today. And by the dawn of the 1940s, the only thing of significance this little street would achieve in the coming years were efforts to close it down. And what was left around it, architecturally speaking, was fading with it. The fountain had become a battered, stained blight on the area, leading to extensive work being done on it starting in 1956 and being completed in the summer of the following year. The new market building would fall into disrepair and even have its north wing removed in 1956. The epicenter of the city's Skid Row, 2nd and Burnside, was only a square block away. But there would be one change that actually brought something new to the area. By the start of 1948, the city's fire department needed a new location, a place where, from the get-go, they could respond to fires quickly and have as little traffic issues as possible. An original plan to place the new station along Front Avenue between Salmon and Taylor fell through, leaving the department to look for a new location. They felt the block south of Vine, where Ankeny Block as well as the Lewis and Flanders Block once stood, might suit them nicely. It was a sure thing that traffic, at least, would be less. A deal would be reached where the fire department exchanged the property where their old station was at 4th and Taylor, along with $10,000, for the property on Block 34, as it was called. But while this deal was in the works, the fire department also hoped to obtain Block 35, or the triangular block between Ankeny and Vine. This would allow them a little more land for the new station, and possibly a small park-like space by Skidmore Fountain. This planned purchase would also include the removal of Vine Street, as it would just be in the way, and a slight widening of Ankeny was also proposed. In July 1948, the Portland City Council approved the purchase of Block 35 at a cost of $16,862. A tax levy, up to voters in November of that same year, was also needed to pass to provide the funding needed to do what was desired with that block. That levy passed, and yet, come the 1950s, Vine Street was still around. Whatever the end plans were for Block 35, they did not come to immediate fruition. And as this area sat there, waiting for the next thing to come along, it continued to fuel the debate over whether the Skidmore Fountain deserved to be elsewhere. Here's some photographic trickery from 1949, showing the fountain moved to the South Park blocks across the street from the Portland Art Museum. As the 50s dragged on, however, so did Vine Street's irrelevance. The area it inhabited was described as abandoned, narrow, and even musty. While the occasional newspaper article popped up in searches I did, come the 1950s, 99% of the Vine Street references I found in Portland newspapers were in reference to the Vine Street in Hollywood, California. And the push to move the fountain remained, with even City Mayor Fred Peterson saying in 1956, "I am no longer satisfied that a dreary, unfrequented street intersection is the best possible place for a sculpture group that many authorities regard as the city's finest work." There were lots of new destination ideas for the fountain, ranging from the South Park blocks to Lonsdale Square to Washington Park, or more specifically the International Rose Test Garden, and so on. Even Portland historian Stuart Holbrook suggested moving it to the Goose Hollow area on the former site of the home of Jacob Comm. But the move never came, and come 1959, the sentiment seemed to be, well, if we can't move the fountain to a park space, we'll bring the park space to the fountain. In this year, an idea for a space originally referred to as Fountain Park, and later the Skidmore Fountain Plaza development, was suggested to try and in some way revive this dreary dead space that surrounded the hardly used and hardly useful Vine Street. An artist rendering of what the site would look like was presented, complete with a lawn space, benches, new trees, and even gas lights that originally stood on the streets of Baltimore, Maryland. The local Junior Chamber of Commerce was the driving force behind this project, which would be approved by the City Council in February 1960. The long-term hope was that by reviving an area of such past historical significance, it might inspire preserving other nearby historic structures. Of course, a key aspect of this project, getting rid of Vine Street. It didn't seem like anyone would miss it, and most people in town probably didn't know it was around in the first place. The vacating of Vine Street would end up being the most complex aspect of getting this project up and running, as doing such a thing comes with a lot of legal red tape. It required an ordinance to be put before City Council on August 10, 1960, to vacate Vine Street and a portion of Ankeny Street. While this was passed, Ankeny Street would not be vacated. We can see here, even by 1975, the narrow Ankeny was still open, but not for much longer. The earliest work started right after that ordinance was passed in August, and included the repainting of the nearby Packer Scott building to make it look more like it did in its earlier years. December 1960 would be the official end of Vine Street, at least as a route accessible by motor vehicles. By this time, it had existed for over a century, and now it had the chance to experience the beginning of its end as a crew of mainly volunteer Marines began digging the street up. This included exposing those old Belgian blocks, which by this time had been covered up with asphalt. The hope was that the blocks could be salvaged to use in making a pattern around the new trees. In an overhead view of the completed park, we can see blocks laid all around the young trees planted. I can only assume these were those blocks pulled up from Vine Street. This would be followed by the placement of new blocks in the plaza area. There were so many blocks piled up on site for the job that a wood structure was put up around Skidmore Fountain, primarily out of the fear that vandals might throw some of these blocks at it. In all fairness, the city had just invested a lot of time and money in restoring the thing. Matching fairly well with the original artwork and plans, come September 1962, the new Skidmore Plaza, as it was primarily called, was officially completed and opened up. And for any newcomers to town, you'd probably never know there was once a street running right through it. However, despite the charm and revitalization of the area, being just around the corner from Skid Row, over time the plaza developed a reputation of what was called a wino hangout. In 1971, complete with artwork to match, a piece of poetry was published in the Oregonian that included the passage, "In Skidmore Plaza, the nearby Willamette, polluted as these winos sprawled on the grass, destructing youth and memory with empty bottles." Not exactly Robert Frost, but it expressed the issue of the time. And while the area has gone through more changes since then, it's sustained a reputation as a place where locals in the throes of addiction spend their time. However, the alcoholism of the 50s, 60s, and 70s has mostly been replaced by drugs. But the area did have one more transformation to go through, over the grave of the former Vine Street, that being the establishment of Ankeny Plaza, a project announced in 1977. The arcade was one element of multiple things coming to pass in relation to restoring structures in the area, that which was hoped for with the 1962 Skidmore Plaza. A key element of this new setup was that it was to include several pieces from buildings previously demolished, such as the Deacom and Reed Block, the Ladin Tilton Bank, the McBreen Building, and, most significantly, columns from the 1883 Smith and Watson Block. While history was being saved all around, this area was getting its next facelift by becoming a memorial place for that which was lost. And blocks that were salvaged from work on the city's transit mall would be put down in this new arcade. And even to this day, as a possible reminder of what once was, the stretch where Vine Street once existed consists of blocks, as was the case a long, long time ago. With the arcade being completed in 1978, the whole area around it, known as the Skidmore Old Town Historic District, was added to the National Register of Historic Places. So much salvation, so much revival, so much happening with one thing left behind: lost to memory. The history of Vine Street is not so much intriguing for the street itself and what specifically happened on it, but rather for the world it existed in that changed so much over time. Most of the time, it went unnoticed, but it was always there.